Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this Modern Slavery Awareness Training Deck. I'm part of an organization called Value Match, where we help SMEs and the public sector with their sustainability and procurement performance. But without going too much into the introductions, let's go right into the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm very excited to see what you learn from this. So for this Modern Slavery Awareness Deck, we're going to be covering a variety of topics, such as what is modern slavery and human trafficking and defining it, how widespread is modern slavery and human trafficking, where might I encounter modern slavery and human trafficking, based on jurisdiction or based on sector as well, and why should we care about modern slavery and human trafficking? Very important question to address, especially when talking about it with suppliers. What can I do about it as an individual? And what can we do about it as organizations, as businesses, with our systems and processes? So that's the agenda that we're going to be covering today. So jumping straight into it, what is modern slavery and human trafficking? How do we define it, and what can it look like? So modern slavery and human trafficking, Anti-Slavery International, who have been around for a really long time, sum it up quite well. It's when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain, and this is achieved whether by trickery, coercion, being forced. These victims lose their freedom. So in a very simplistic sense, it's a convergence of two different things, as you can see on the screen. The means, which is being tricked, coerced, or forced. It's how the person is manipulated. And then it's a convergence of the purpose on the other side, the pink circle, which the purpose is always for either personal and or commercial gain. And when you have these two come together, you come up with a situation of modern slavery or forced labor. And modern slavery, you need to understand that it's an umbrella term that covers a variety of crimes, such as human trafficking, debt bondage, forced labor, sex exploitation, child labor. This is by no means a completely exhaustive list. Modern slavery does also cover things not on the screen, such as organ trafficking, forced marriage, domestic servitude, so on and so forth. But ultimately, it's when a person is tricked, coerced, or forced into a situation that is for someone else's personal or commercial gain. That's a very simplistic way of understanding it. That's a great basis for moving forward. One thing that's really important to note is that while as business and sustainability professionals, we're trying to prevent forced labor and modern slavery scenarios, but what we actually have to be really careful of is something called the exploitation continuum. So on the one side of the spectrum of the continuum, you have decent work on the left in green, and you have forced labor, which is some of the worst labor conditions, on the right in red. And what this continuum means is that despite us wanting to prevent forced labor scenarios, really what we should be doing as responsible business practitioners is preventing labor law violations at all levels, because the more labor law violations are present, the more risky a situation becomes, and the more likely it becomes to become a forced labor scenario. So really, we want to be maintaining that business sustainability and integrity at all levels and take a zero-tolerance approach to labor law violations as much as we can. We don't even want to get to the point of a forced labor scenario, is what we're trying to say here through the continuum. So how widespread is modern slavery and human trafficking? Where can we find it? What are the numbers? So in terms of global prevalence, the Global Slavery Index estimated that on any given day in 2021, there were 50 million victims worldwide, 17.3 million of which were in forced labor within the private sector. And in 2014, the International Labor Organization estimated that modern slavery and human trafficking makes around $150 billion US dollars in profit each year. Unfortunately, the numbers are likely to be much higher, both on the victim side as well as the profit side, because the crime is clandestine and hidden in nature. So it's almost impossible to measure accurately because it's hidden. So in terms of prevalence in the UK, the Global Slavery Index, same thing we referenced before, estimates that the UK has a prevalence of around 122,000 victims. Now, this is an estimate, keep in mind. However, we do have what's called the National Referral Mechanism, NRM, in the UK, which gives us much more concrete figures. However, they are very conservative because the NRM depends on people coming and reporting to be potential victims of modern slavery, and by nature of the crime, it's actually very difficult for victims to report. So these figures are evidence-based, however, they're likely very conservative compared to the actual number. So looking at the 2022 statistics from the NRM, the most common victims were Albanians, British, and Eritreans. There was a 33% increase in referrals from 2021 to 2022, and between Q1 of 2023 and that of 2022, referrals increased by about 26%. So we're actually seeing that the numbers are going up and up, which is really not encouraging. It paints a very bleak picture for prevalence in the UK. So where might we encounter modern slavery and human trafficking, especially within our business practice? So on screen here, I have a list of high-risk sectors. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Some certain sectors, such as extractive sectors like logging or mining, have been excluded from the list. However, this covers quite a lot of them. So we have manufacturing, textiles, agriculture, food processing, construction, facilities management, warehousing and logistics, and so on and so forth at the bottom. A lot of businesses will engage with these sectors, which makes supply chains quite high risk. So feel free to have a think about which sectors of these you engage with most and what kind of risks you may be faced with these sectors in your supply chains. So I've picked a few of these sectors to cover why they are high risk, why they're usually high risk, and I've picked 4 different sectors to show case studies as well as transferable principles that make them high risk, regardless of jurisdiction and sector often. So with these sectors on screen, there can often be largely non-public facing work. So, manufacturing, food processing, those tend to be in sites that the public aren't normally there, in industrial estates or separate areas from communities. So it's harder for exploitation to be spotted in that sense. Facilities management can sometimes be done during nighttime or out of hours times, which means that there's less people around to spot exploitation. A lot of these sectors on screen, they may have a high reliance on migrant labor. This is certainly the case for construction. A lot of the construction sector is deeply dependent on migrant labor, not from the UK. And so that's one risk. I do want to caveat that migrant labor in itself is not a risk. It's more that if the protective infrastructure isn't in place for them, then they become at risk. So, migrants are more susceptible to perhaps not knowing the local language fluently, perhaps having poor contract terms, not knowing their labor rights and being manipulated that way. So if the protective infrastructure is there to safeguard them, then they're an absolutely great asset to the country, to the workforce. But if the protective infrastructure is not there, they're quite susceptible to risk of exploitation. Furthermore, there's a high usage of low-skilled labor. I personally don't think it's to do with the skill. I think it's more to do with the replaceability of workers. So, low-skilled labor, because it's more replaceable, contract terms may not be as good. This is highly prevalent within many jurisdictions, especially within the manufacturing sectors, the construction sectors, and facilities management as well. And furthermore, high usage of seasonal labor. This is an issue because sometimes because of labor demand, companies and businesses may cut corners on their recruiting due diligence, which then risks bringing in potentially exploited individuals into their workforce. So those are some very general principles as to why certain sectors are high risk, and they can often be transferable across different sectors and have commonalities. So in terms of looking at specific case studies for these sectors, I've looked at ones that are relevant specifically to the UK and also ones that are relevant further down the supply chain. So, tier 2, tier 3, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to textiles, we can just count this as manufacturing in general as well. In 2020, it was discovered that working conditions were incredibly poor for textiles workers in Leicester, in England. And 2 years later, surveys are still finding that working conditions are still poor. So it shows that modern slavery and human trafficking and labor exploitation is not just an imported problem into the UK, it's actually very present in the UK as well, and we have to be active in looking out for it. Then moving down the supply chain to Myanmar, currently the country is going through a civil war with certain parts of the country being in control by the military junta. So a lot of brands such as H&M are having to look at potentially exiting Myanmar over over the labor abuses that are occurring in textiles factories there, unfortunately. This brings up a whole different discussion around responsible exit and what that realistically looks like, but that's not within the scope of this presentation. For food processing, Ukrainian workers have historically been exploited on UK farms even prior to the invasion. But however, we are finding that Ukrainian workers, many of whom are refugees in the UK, are being exploited on UK farms and facing very, very poor working conditions. And in the US, some states are actually rolling back their laws around child labor, which means that some children are finding work that they shouldn't be finding in meat processing plants and getting serious injuries from things like equipment that's meant to cut meat and process it. So it's very sad, it's quite disturbing, but it shows that modern slavery and exploitation can appear anywhere if we're not careful. Looking at facilities management, once again, Ukrainians, many of whom are refugees, are found to be exploited within either cleaning businesses or cleaning functions of a business. And furthermore, during the pandemic, cleaners faced really poor working conditions during the pandemic, such as insufficient PPE, insufficient equipment, as well as really poor contract terms that made them reluctant to take sick leave or sick pay. So that's an overview of the facilities management sector. And looking at construction, Albanian migrants are being exploited in UK construction. This is especially more and more so the case since the influx of Albanian migrants to the UK. And furthermore, the UK actually risks being a dumping ground for Xinjiang solar components due to slightly more relaxed legislation around supply chains. So this is a beyond tier 1 risk, as a lot of polysilicon and solar panel components come from China or Chinese-owned businesses, unfortunately. And this poses a serious risk for the renewable energy sector in the UK and Europe. So why should we care about modern slavery and human trafficking? This is such an important question to address. When I'm talking to suppliers, when I'm talking to clients, and friends as well, I need to have an answer prepared. So I see it on different levels, on the individual, the community, the global, and then the sustainability goals level. So in terms of harm against individuals, modern slavery, labor exploitation tends to disproportionately affect vulnerable demographics such as women, children, refugees, asylum seekers, and ethnic minorities. They're most often at risk. So by combating modern slavery and human trafficking, we are, in effect, protecting vulnerable demographics and helping them to live better lives, living more prosperous lives. Moving up to a higher level of communities, it oftentimes, where there's a prevalence of modern slavery and human trafficking, you may see a prevalence of things like drugs trafficking, county lines, money laundering, and in some of the worst cases, systematic oppression of people groups. This is something that we're seeing in certain jurisdictions like China, where the native population, the Uyghurs, are being put into forced labor. Moving further on, modern slavery and human trafficking can also endanger global security. And in one particular case study, the UK's public procurement for PPE was found to have hidden forced labor of North Koreans from Chinese factories, and roughly 70% of their wages would be taken from the North Korean workers and sent to the North Korean state. So this could risk funding nuclear weapons proliferation programs, unfortunately, and therefore reducing geopolitical security worldwide. So, and moving to a bit more of a philosophical level, with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, UN SDGs, combating modern slavery and human trafficking actually touches on a lot of the SDGs, and I've picked 6 that are probably the most direct, such as number 1, no poverty. By giving decent work and decent economic growth through that, we're encouraging a world without poverty. We're also reducing inequalities, because a lot of labor exploitation usually can involve discrimination against women or ethnic minorities or sexual minorities. Moving forward, providing good and decent work promotes good health and well-being, obviously. Prevention of child labor promotes quality education and an upbringing for children. And furthermore, where we see modern slavery and human trafficking very prevalent, it's often within jurisdictions where there's perhaps low levels of peace, low levels of rule of law, and perhaps a lot of corruption. So by preventing modern slavery and human trafficking, we're actually promoting SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. So furthermore, one area of study that's been quite upcoming is the links between modern slavery and climate change. This is just based on one paper from Nottingham University Rights Lab. Modern slavery and climate change actually have a two-way cyclical relationship. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, modern slavery can promote certain environmentally damaging activities, particularly within sectors that are extractive like agriculture or mining, which then exacerbates climate change and environmental destruction, which then leads to more climate change, which can lead to vulnerability for certain communities, especially those that depend on agrarian lifestyles. And then that drives people into further vulnerability to exploitation, which then repeats in that cycle. So this is a very serious problem, given that by 2050, it's estimated that more than 140 million people will have been displaced by climate change. This is an estimate from the World Bank. So really, due diligence measures to mitigate modern slavery and human trafficking can also be used to combat climate change, because you're monitoring your supply chains, monitoring their performance. And by doing this, we're actively trying to promote positive social impact and value throughout our supply chains and our value chains. So another reason that we should be caring is that there's increasing legislative pressure on modern slavery and human trafficking. So one of the most guiding pieces or documents, really, worldwide, is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 2011, or we just call them the UNGPs. This essentially, the spirit of this document says that businesses have a responsibility to not only recognize their potential and actual adverse impacts, but also work to remedy them, no matter their size, sector, or jurisdiction. So those guiding principles have filtered their way down into local and national legislation worldwide, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act 2015, MSA. This was groundbreaking legislation at the time. However, more legislation has since come that has advanced further from it. The UK government is looking to make changes soon, and these should be upcoming. So the UK MSA, will go into more detail about that later. So the Modern Slavery Act was notably a reporting requirement kind of legislation. But moving forward, we had due diligence requirement style legislation, such as the US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act 2021, which essentially the US bans any product that it knows to come from Xinjiang for forced labor, unless it can be proven that there was no forced labor. And then moving forward, we have the German LKSG, or the German Supply Chain Act 2023. This essentially is a due diligence requirement that also introduces penalties, such as, I believe it's 4% of global turnover, up to 4%. So quite biting legislation. And then finally, most recently, we've had the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS3D. This shares a lot of similarities to the German LKSG and also imposes penalties. It'll still take around 2 years for individual member states of the EU to implement this into their own respective legislation, but the pressure is mounting legislatively from that perspective. So looking more locally at the UK Modern Slavery Act, in particular, we should be concerned about Section 54, which is the Transparency in Supply Chains section. So this means that all organizations with over £36 million of turnover annually have to publish a modern slavery statement with specific sections outlining their due diligence measures, their policies, organization structure, KPIs, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, this doesn't have any penalties for non-compliance. So there are upcoming changes that have been announced, but aren't making too much movement at the moment, but they should be here hopefully soon. So there will be mandatory disclosure of countries of origin and overseas government employment agencies required for these statements. There will be a requirement for arranging audits and inspections. And finally, there will be fines of up to 4% of global turnover, up to 20 million pounds. So finally bringing in the penalties aspect to the legislation. So the case for small and medium enterprises, SMEs. So why should SMEs care? SMEs should really care because if they're wanting to bid into the private sector, a lot of the large private sector companies are now having increased regulatory requirements, and they also risk a lot of reputation damage if MSHT is discovered within their supply chains. So the private sector has this responsibility and thus are going to be cascading it down onto any SME suppliers that they may have. Likewise, the public sector also has these requirements. Increasingly, There's requirements for social value. There's requirements for modern slavery mitigation, as well as carbon reduction. So SMEs that want to bid into the public sector are going to have to show that they can deliver on social value, that they can deliver on modern slavery prevention within their supply chains. Speaking of help for SMEs, at Value Match, we have the Sustainability, Diversity, and Social Impact, SDSI team. And really, human rights and labor standards is just one part of a sustainability strategy. And at the SDSI team, we use something called the Social Impact and Improvement Model, which looks across 6 different areas of sustainability to help SMEs and businesses wanting to bid into public procurement to formulate their sustainability strategy over the long term to not only assure compliance, but also to future-proof their sustainability activities. So these 6 areas that we look at are environmental management, human rights and labor standards, which we're talking about now, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, resource use and circular economy, social value delivery, and health and well-being. If you're interested in any of this, our contact details will be at the end. And finally, I think that the reason why we should be caring about modern slavery and human trafficking is ultimately, I think there's a moral imperative beyond anything else. So I want to highlight a story that is one of my favorites. So the person on screen here is a man called Euan Chan, who before communist China came into existence, there was the Republic of China. And Euan Chan was the consul general to Vienna between 1938 and 1940. And he was set in the context of the Nazi annexation of Austria and the persecution of the Austrian Jews. And, you know, while he wasn't a particularly powerful man, he wasn't a military leader, he acted within his capacity and within his context as much as he could and rescued thousands of Jews by issuing them visas to China to escape to safety when many other countries had shut their doors to the Jews. So the ultimate message of this is that we have an inherent responsibility to use our legal, cultural, social context, position, or capacity to protect and uphold people and their protection. So really, no matter what status we have or what power we have a responsibility to use that which we do have to protect people. So that's the moral imperative. So what can I as an individual do about modern slavery and human trafficking? It's important to understand and spot the signs of exploitation. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but people who are exploited may appear malnourished, they may have signs of physical abuse, they may not own many things, they may be wearing the same clothes daily, they may be fearful and anxious, they may be avoidant, they may also appear to be under someone else's control when they're with an exploiter or a potential exploiter. Once again, by no means an exhaustive list, and really, you have to analyze these signs within the context that you're in, and if it feels suspicious, it's probably better to report. So if you see something suspicious or just need advice, if it's an urgent situation where someone's in immediate danger, call 999. However, if it's to report a suspicion or to ask for advice, you can call the Modern Slavery helpline that's operated by Unseen, and in the number on screen. And finally, talking to friends, family, colleagues, and clients about the issue is really a great way to champion it and try to raise awareness. That's arguably the most important thing. That's why we're putting this presentation online. So what can we do about modern slavery and human trafficking? How can you as an organization combat it? While this is a generalized presentation and I can't answer these questions for you, I have put some questions on the screen that will help you and your colleagues and your organization think through what kind of tools and processes you have at the moment to screen for exploitation and how potentially you could enhance these. So these are some useful questions to think through, but feel free to do this in your own time and take your own pace at it, but I find these to be very useful to think about. So coming towards the end of the presentation, I just want to introduce you to the SDSI team that I was talking about. We have Laura Davies, she's our Director of Supplier Services. We have myself, I'm a supplier manager at Value Match, and we have Rosie Martin, who's our junior SDSI consultant. So if you want any sort of advice around general sustainability for SMEs or public sector procurement, Laura Davies is your person to go to. However, for myself, if you want any advice around business and human rights issues, then please feel free to contact me. My contact details are on the screen here. And thank you very much for coming to this presentation and watching it. I hope it's been useful. I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback and to hearing from you and having a chat. Hope you have an amazing rest of your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Take care.